My name is Don Peavy. We're at the Westernville Town Hall. It's Saturday, and today's the 22nd
hmm
of April already. So we just had a meeting with the town clerk discussing some issues. And while we were there, this young lady stopped in with some questions on zoning or planning.
Zoning, the solar bylaw that the town is in development with.
Okay.
Yeah,
So if you could give us your name and who
sure.
you work for?
So my name is Leigh McEntire. I work with Soul Source Power. We're out of Troy, New
Sole
York.
Source?
Soul
Okay.
Source, SOLSOURCE Power.
Oh, nice.
We're
Okay.
out of Troy. We're local. I grew up in Camden.
Mhm.
So we do solar farm development across the state. So 5 megawatt solar. It's about 20 to 30 acres of solar. We just got a project permitted in the town of Ansville
Okay.
next door. So we're working with some local landowners right now. We're very, very much in the early stages of development. So
Mhm.
trying to see what the town has for their bylaws, make sure that we fit into that.
Can I ask you a couple of questions with
Yeah,
respect to the overall concept of these farms?
yeah.
I've seen many organizations or many towns, um, Oneida and New Hartford,
hmm
are passing a lot of different things, trying to limit where those are
hmm
because of the explosive growth. So, I mean, you're a part of the face of the kind
hmm
of activity that goes on with that kind of stuff. Is your job to kind of interface with the small towns and villages and try to keep them informed of what you're doing and
hmm
build a positive approach to this from your viewpoint?
I think that's what we try to do, at least at Soul Source. I think there's a misconception that solar could go up everywhere. And there's a fear in New York, especially in these small towns, that solar is going to cover everything. But in reality, I think, at the most, towns are looking at potentially 4 to 5 solar farms, if any. So we're really tied to the infrastructure. So the lines that come through town, if that infrastructure, a lot of it's really old. So if that can't fit solar, then you can't do it.
I
Um,
see.
so in a lot of towns, they'll have um, sometimes they'll have very restrictive bylaws where you can only build in certain zones,
Build altogether or build what you're.
build solar farms. So you could do residential solar in most places, being, solar on the house or solar, maybe a small ground mount that feeds a house
Mhm.
or a business. Those generally can go most places. And those are typically covered under the Unified Solar Permit that was, NYSERDA put that out a few years
Okay.
ago. A lot of towns have adopted that. For the larger scale solar, that tends to be what's restricted with some of the bylaws. But I think it really depends on a town's appetite for solar and if they're open to it. It can bring some revenue for the town. So we enter into pilot agreements, payments in lieu of taxes with the town, the county, and the school district. Essentially so that we make a payment every year, and we add an escalator to that. So that's a 15-year agreement to be paid to those
I
jurisdictions.
got you.
Yeah.
Interesting. So with my experience in Westmoreland, from what I've seen, they have one on what is the main drive? 233
Okay.
on the right if you're coming towards Rome,
Yep.
and that
Yeah.
is right on the road,
Mm-hmm.
right on the.
Yeah.
So anybody driving down is going to see that. Is that bad or is that good? My concern or my thought was that
Mm-hmm.
why would they approve something like that? That is such a base infrastructure that could be placed anywhere
Mm-hmm.
on that parcel or those parcels in that area
Mm-hmm.
and leave the roadside for more commercial purposes instead of eating it up with something that just sits there.
Yeah. That's a question that comes up a lot. And I think there's an element to this where the landowner has to be interested in doing this. Solar is something that can go up and they don't have to do the work for that. Typically, they get paid lease payments for that. They don't have to worry about any construction of a building. So it's really, there's a piece to it that's the landowner's appetite to want to do that. And we often hear that, we're allowing it in certain districts. We'll allow it, you can do it on all of these parcels. And often we'll send out mailers to those landowners, and they're not interested. But there's also another element, and it's the national grid infrastructure. So
There's
sometimes
a lot of things you have to try to fit in to make it this work.
it's usually around 1 in 100 parcels or so that might work for solar, possibly. There's also wetlands issues that come up.
Information online to the people is going to. I just want to. You've seen it before. I don't know. Have you?
Very often, I think towns struggle. Obviously there's funding issues, but generally it's also a know-how along with funding issues and along with all of these changes that they'd have to make to go digital and to go online. New York has a lot of small towns. And if you look across, it's towns and it's villages that are separate too. So I think there's a difficulty to go digital. And, I know that you guys are really trying to get there. There is a level of patience you have to have too, because it's a lot of change. We work with a lot of towns. We often are reaching out to the clerks for the minutes because they're not online. There's a few towns that I work in that do have videos online, that have everything online, and those are generally the much, much bigger towns that have a large staff that's available.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of benefits to community solar. And I bring it out to New York because New York has a community solar program, and they established it so that rather than large off-takers like large manufacturers benefiting from the energy that's produced, you can benefit, or any national grid ratepayers can benefit from it. So there's those benefits are in terms of the energy that's produced, and you would just subscribe to that energy and get a discount on your bill.
Sure. So I'm familiar with that, yes.
And that's such a good program through New York. There's also the pilot payments, that's payments in lieu of taxes that we would pay without really adding an additional burden to the jurisdictions. We're paying into that tax system on a piece of property that currently doesn't have very high taxes. So that adds a lot of value to the town, the school, the county.
So it's a benefit for the town to adopt this kind of program because they get additional tax revenues.
Yes.
How is it? What is it that you're doing here today that brings us together?
So it's more of just trying to figure out where the town sits in terms of their solar bylaw. It sounds like they're discussing it now. They haven't adopted it yet. And what we want to do is make sure that we're fitting into the bounds of that bylaw, because if they pass something that restricts it so that we can't develop on this property, we're already investing in wetlands delineations and surveys and studies with National Grid that are rather costly. And knowing now that they're developing this bylaw, we want to make sure we fit into that, because if we don't, then we'll have to abandon the project.
So you're here on with respect to the owners of a property that are interested in installing solar somewhere in the town. And so your responsibility to you and to them, you're representing them, if you will, in a way, to find out what the town has on their books as far as requirements for you to do what you're going to do here for them.
There's a piece of that. There's a piece too to get a sense of some towns, and you mentioned this when they're drafting their bylaws, tend to be really restrictive because sometimes they don't want solar anywhere. And it's really important at the outset of a project to understand if a town doesn't have an appetite for solar, because even when it fits into the bylaws, if a town really doesn't want it there, then it just doesn't work. And it has to work for them. It has to work for the landowner. It has to work for us. So that's also the piece to it too. And I know with them discussing the bylaws, sometimes these bylaws are discussed for months and months and months on end, sometimes years. So also to get a sense of what the timeline is on that for us too. And obviously, as we put the engineering diagrams together, we want to know what the setbacks are, if there's any restrictions for screening. So you mentioned the array on Route 233.
Yes.
So a lot of towns at the outset of when community solar came out in New York didn't have any sort of rules or regulations around screening of the arrays. So a lot of these arrays went up and there wasn't any screening. now what's happening is a lot of towns have rules around that screening. And even if they don't, it comes up during the seeker process. So we're often having to provide additional screening in certain areas, and that changes the distance from, the fence line to the road if we're putting screening in there, but it's also something that we factor into the construction costs when we're modeling all of this out, and it's an important part for the community. So we try to cite projects that are sort of hidden, and really tall trees that are screening it. But that's another piece that we're kind of just on this fact-finding mission to see what we can do and if there's any changes we can make right now.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So that's a very quick interview with Leigh from Sole Source Power, who is working on behalf of a property owner here in the town of Western to get some feedback from the town board on maybe what the requirements are for the projects that she's going forward with here in town. So we appreciate you coming out, and we appreciate running into you here to get a little bit of information on what you're doing with Sole Source here and helping out some of the residents in town, and maybe even helping the town with additional tax dollars and revenues. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. It was nice to meet you. I appreciate this.